Dear learners, I am Dr. Preeti Khalila Raskwa. Welcome you all to this session on agency and power in oral history. This is module 28 of your MOOC on oral history. You have learned a lot about oral history. I'm not going to repeat again what is oral history, what are its definitions, what are its contents, all these things. But briefly, oral history is a method of historical research that collects and interprets memories, experiences, and personal narratives of individuals. Unlike traditional written history that relies mainly on documents and archives, oral history gives voice to people whose experiences may not have been recorded in official records. However, the process of collecting and interpreting oral narratives involves important questions of agency and power. Now, in this session, we are going to learn historians' authority and interpretative power, informed consent, and censorship in oral history. But before going to this main discussion, let us learn two basic concepts of this discussion. Their agency in oral history, and second one is power relation in oral history. Now, firstly, let us discuss agency in oral history. Agency refers to the ability of individuals or communities to express their own experiences and perspectives. Power, on the other hand, relates to who controls the process of recording, interpreting, and presenting those narratives. In oral history, power relationships may exist between historian and narrators, institutions and communities, and between public memory and private experiences. Issues such as historians' authority, interpretative power, informed consent, and censorship therefore became central to ethical and responsible oral history practices. In oral history, the main agent is the narrator, the person who shares the story or personal experiences. The narrator is considered the central agent because oral history is built upon the memories, interpretations, and lived experiences of individuals. The narrator provides first hand accounts of events, social conditions, cultural practices, and personal perspectives that may not be recorded in written documents. Through storytelling, narrator actively shape historical understanding by explaining how they experienced and interpreted the past. Their memories, emotions, and viewpoints therefore became essential sources of historical knowledge. However, the historian also plays an important role as a facilitator and interpreter. The historian designs the interviews, asks questions, records the conversations, and analyzes the narratives. While the historian helps structure and interpret the material, the voice and experiences of the narrator remain the core of oral history. Thus, historian plays a central role in the process of oral history. Unlike traditional historical research that relies mainly on written documents, oral history requires historians to actively interact with individuals who shares their memories and experiences. The historian is responsible for collecting, recording, interpreting, and preserving personal narratives so that they became part of historical knowledge. One important role of the historian is designing the research and conducting interviews. The historian identifies suitable participants, prepares interview questions, and creates a comfortable environment where narrator can share their stories openly. Through careful listening and respectful dialogue, historians encourage narrators to reflect on their experiences and provide detailed accounts of the past. Another major responsibility of the historian is recording and documenting the narratives. This includes audio or visual recordings, transcriptions, and proper archiving of the interviews. Accurate documentation ensures that the memories shared by the individuals are preserved for future researchers and communities. Historians also have the task of interpreting the oral testimonies. Since memories can be subjective and influenced by personal experiences, historians analyze these narratives carefully and compare them with other historical sources such as documents, photographs, and archival materials. This process helps provide context and deeper understanding of the events described. In addition, historians must follow ethical principles when working with oral history participants. They must obtain informed consent, respect confidentiality when required, and ensure that the narrator's voices are represented fairly. Modern oral history practices emphasizes collaborations where historians recognize narrator as partners in the creation of historical knowledge. Then, power relation in oral history. Power dynamics are inherent in the oral history process because historians usually design the research projects, select interviews, record conversations, etc. Institutions such as universities, archives, or museums may also influence how oral histories are collected and presented. These power relations can affect whose voices are included or excluded, how stories are framed and interpreted, which narratives became part of public memory. To balance these dynamics, modern oral history emphasizes participatory approaches, where narrators have greater control over how their stories are recorded, preserved, and shared. Then, historians' authority and interpretative power. Historians traditionally occupy a position of authority in the process of studying and interpreting the past. Their training in historical methods, critical analysis, and source evaluations give them the responsibility to collect, examine, and interpret historical evidence. In oral history, however, this authority becomes more complex because the primary source of information is the spoken memories and experiences of individuals. While narrators provide personal testimonies, historians often shape how these narratives are documented, analyzed, and presented. As a result, historians possess significant interpretative power that can influence how oral histories are understood by wider audiences. Oral history involves a close interactions between the historians and the narrator. Although the narrator recounts personal memories, the historian's role in guiding the interview and interpreting the testimony means that the final historical narrative is often the result of collaboration, but not always equal collaboration. The historian's decision about what questions to ask, what information to highlight, and how to contextualize the story within broader historical events can shape the meaning and significance of the narrator's experiences. Now, let us discuss the role of historian. In oral history research, historians perform several important roles that influence the entire process of collecting and presenting historical narratives. Designing interview questions. The historian prepares interview questions that guide the conversations. These questions determine the direction of the interview and influence what kinds of memories or experiences the narrator discusses. Well-designed questions encourage detailed storytelling, while poorly framed questions may limit or bias the responses. Then, selecting interviewees. Historians also describe who will be the interviewed. This selection process can significantly affect the diversity and representation of perspective within an oral history project. If only certain individuals or groups are chosen, other voices may remain unheard. Then, recording and transcribing narratives. During the interview, the historian records the conversations and later transcribes it into written form. Transcriptions involve choices about punctuations, emphasis, and inclusion or exclusion of certain parts of the conversations. These decisions can subtly shape how narrator's voice is represented. Then, interpreting and contextualizing the stories. After collecting the interviews, historians analyze the narratives and connect them to broader historical context. They interpret the significance of the testimonies and explain how individual experiences relate to larger social, cultural, or political development. Because of these responsibilities, historians hold considerable interpretative authority. Their decisions determine how oral testimonies are organized, analyzed, and eventually presented in books, articles, museums, exhibitions, documentaries, or archival collections. Now let us discuss challenges of interpretative power. While historians' interpretative authority is important for analyzing historical sources, it can also create certain challenges in oral history research. First thing is filtering of narrators' voices. Sometimes the narrator's voice may be unmentionably filtered through the historian's interpretations. When historians summarize or interpret the interview, they may emphasize certain aspects of the story while neglecting the others. This can alter the original meaning of the narrator's experiences. Then, cultural misunderstandings. If the historian comes from a different cultural, social, or linguistic background, then the narrator misunderstandings may arise. Certain expressions, traditions, or oral practices may not be fully understood, which can lead to inaccurate interpretation of the narrative. Then, influence of personal bias. Historians, like all individuals, may have personal beliefs, theoretical perspectives, or academic priorities that influence their interpretation of oral testimonies. These biases can affect how stories are analyzed and presented. To analyze these challenges, responsible historians practice reflectivity. Reflectivity involves critical examining one's own assumptions, values, and positions in the research process. By acknowledging their influence on the interpretations of narratives, historians can strive to present oral histories more fairly and accurately. Then, shared authority. In response to concerns about interpretative power, modern oral history scholars emphasize the concept of shared authority. Shared authority, shared authority means that both the historians and the narrator participate in shaping the historical narrative. Instead of treating narrators merely as source of information, this approach recognizes them as active contributors to historical knowledge. Shared authority can be practiced in several ways. First thing is allowing narrators to review transcripts. After the interview is transcribed, the narrators may read the transcript and suggest corrections or clarifications, then including narrators' feedback in interpretations. Historians may discuss their interpretations with narrators and consider their perspectives before finalizing the research. Then recognizing narrators as co-creator of knowledge. In some cases, narrators are acknowledged as collaborators in publications or research projects. This collaborative approach helps reduce unequal power relations between historian and the narrator. They also make oral history research more inclusive, respectful, and ethically responsible. Then, informed consent in oral history. Informed consent is a fundamental ethical principle in oral history research, ensuring that participants clearly understand and implication of the interview before agreeing to share their personal experiences. Since oral history relies on individuals recounting memories, emotions, and sometimes deeply personal events, it is essential that narrator participate voluntarily and with full awareness of how their stories will be used. Informed consent means that participants are provided with clear information about the research project, including its objectives, the method of recording the interview, and the potential ways the material may be used in publications, archives, documentaries, or educational projects. Narrators should also be informed about where the interview recordings and transcripts will be stored and whether their identity will be publicly revealed or kept confidential. Most importantly, consent must be given freely without any form of pressure, manipulation, or coercions. The importance of informed consent lies in protecting the rights, dignity, and autonomy of the participants. Oral history often deals with sensitive subjects such as war experiences, migrations, discriminations, political conflict, or personal loss. Discussing such experiences may bring back emotional memories, and therefore, participants must have the freedom to decide what they wish to share and what they prefer to keep private. By obtaining informed consent, historians respect for the narrator's personal boundaries and ensure that the research process remains ethical and responsible. It also helps build trust between the interviewer and the narrator, encouraging more open and honest storytelling. In oral history, consent is not considered a one time agreement given only at the beginning of the interview. Rather, it is an ongoing process throughout the research. Participants should always retain the right to withdraw from the interview at any stage if they feel uncomfortable. They may also request that certain sections of their narratives remain private or be restricted from public access. In addition, narrators should have the opportunity to decide whether their recordings and transcriptions can be archived, published, or shared with future researchers. Maintaining this ongoing dialogue between historians and the narrator strengthens mutual trust and ensure that the narrator retain control over their own story. Through such practices, oral history research process became more respectful, transparent, and ethically sound. Then, censorship and control of narratives. Censorship and control of narratives are significant issues in oral history because not all stories that are recorded can always be freely preserved or shared. Censorship in oral history refers to restrictions or limitations placed on what can be documented, archived, or publicly presented. These restrictions may arise from various sources such as governments, institutions, communities, or even the narrators themselves. Since oral history often deals with personal memories, political experiences, and sensitive social issues, certain narratives may be considered controversial, sensitive, or potentially harmful if openly shared. As a result, decisions about what can be recorded, stored, or made public can influence how history is remembered and understood. One form of censorship occurs at the institutional level. Institutions such as archives, museums, research organizations, or funding sometimes set guidelines recording the type of material that can be preserved or published. In some cases, politically sensitive or controversial narratives may be restricted, edited, or excluded from public access. For example, testimonies that criticizes government policies, reveal social injustice, or challenges dominant historical interpretations may face limitations in publication or archiving. Institutional priorities, legal concerns, or funding conditions may therefore influence which histories are preserved and which remain hidden. These selective preservations can shape collective memory by highlighting certain perspectives while marginalizing others. Another important aspect of censorship in oral history is self censorship by narrators. Individuals sharing their memories may choose to withhold certain information or avoid discussing particular experiences. This often happens because narrators fear social criticism, political consequences, or legal risks. Cultural taboos may also discourage people from speaking openly about certain topics such as family conflicts, caste discrimination, gender based violences, or community disputes. In some cases, narrators may avoid recalling traumatic events because discussing them can cause emotional distress. Others may choose to protect the reputation of their family, community, or organizations by leaving out certain details. As a result, some stories may be partially expressed, carefully framed, or omitted entirely, making the historical narrative incomplete. Censorship creates ethical challenges for historians who seek to document and preserve authentic human experiences. On one hand, historians aim at record truthful accounts of the past and ensure that marginalized voices are heard. On the other hand, they must respect the rights, safety, and emotional well being of the narrators. For instance, publishing sensitive testimonies without a narrator's consent could expose them to social criticism or personal harm. Therefore, historians must carefully balance the goal of historical transparency and with ethical responsibility. They may provide options such as anonymity, restricted access to certain recordings or revealed or delayed publication to protect participants. Ultimately, understanding censorship and control of narrative is essential in oral history research. Recognizing the factors that influence what can be or cannot be said helps historians interpret oral testimonies more critically and responsibly. By maintaining ethical sensitivity and respecting the narrator's choices, historians can ensure that oral history remains both a reliable and human method of preserving the voices and experiences of the past. Balancing agency and power in oral history. Balancing agency and power is an important concern in oral history research. While historians traditionally held most of the authority in designing research projects, collecting testimonies, and interpreting narratives, modern oral history increasingly recognizes the need to create a more equitable relationship between researcher and the participants. Agency refers to the ability of individuals or communities to express their own experiences, perspectives, and interpretations of the past. In order to respect this agency, historians today strive to reduce unequal power dynamics and promote more inclusive and collaborative research practices. One of the key ways to balance agency and power is by involving communities in the design of research projects. Instead of historians describing the research topics alone, community members can participate in identifying important themes, events, or issues that should be documented. This approach ensures that the project reflects the interests and priorities of the people whose histories are being recorded. It also helps historians gain a deeper understanding of the cultural and social context of the narratives they collect. Another important practice is sharing interview recordings and transcripts with narrators. After an interview is completed and transcribed, narrators can review the materials to ensure that their words have been accurately recorded. They may correct factual errors, clarify certain statements, or request the removal of certain sections they feel uncomfortable sharing publicly. This process not only improves the accuracy of the historical record but also gives narrators greater control over their own stories. Historians also attempt to balance power by allowing narrators to influence the interpretation of their experiences. Rather than imposing a single academic interpretations, researchers may discuss their analysis with participants and consider their perspectives when presenting the narrative. These collaborative interpretations acknowledge that the narrator's understanding of the event is an essential part of the historical account, providing community access to archives and digital collections is another important step toward equitable oral history practices. In the past, many oral history materials were stored in academic institutions that were difficult for communities to access. Today, historians increasingly work to make recordings, transcriptions, and related materials available through community archives, local museums, and digital platforms. This ensures that the people whose histories are documented can benefit from and engage with these resources. Finally, balancing agency and power requires respecting cultural norms and sensitivities. Different communities may have specific traditions, values, or expectations regarding storytelling and sharing of knowledge. Historians must approach these cultural contexts and sensitivity and respect, ensuring that their research practices do not violate local customs or community value. Through these collaborative and community based approaches, oral history becomes a more participatory and democratic process. Rather than being a one sided interpretation controlled solely by historians, oral history evolves into a dialogue between researcher and the narrators. This balance of agency and power helps produce richer, more inclusive historical narratives that better represent the voices and experiences of the diverse communities. Now, we are going to conclude this session. In this session, we have discussed central role of agency and power. Agency and power are fundamental issues in oral history because the method involves interactions between narrators, historians, and institutions. These relationships influence how historical knowledge is created and shared. Then we have also discussed oral history as a platform of personal voices. Oral history provides individuals and communities with an opportunity to share their personal experiences, memories, and interpretations of the past, especially those who may not appear in traditional written records. Then influence of historians' authority. Historians often design research projects, select interviews, conduct interviews, and interpret the narratives. Their academic training and methodological choices give them considerable authority in shaping how oral testimonies are presented and understood. Then we have learned about the role of historian and role of institutions. Institutions such as universities, museums, archives, and funding bodies may influence oral history projects by determining research priorities, preserving methods, and public access to recorded narratives. Impact on historical representation of these power structures, certain voices or perspectives may be emphasized while others may be overlooked, affecting how history is represented and remembered in society. Then, importance of ethical awareness. Ethical oral history practices require historians to recognize and critically examine these power dynamics. Awareness of such issues helps ensure that the research process remains fair, respectful, and responsible. Then, principle of shared authority. Modern oral history encourages shared authority between historians and the narrator, recognizing participants as active contributors and co-creators of historical knowledge rather than merely source of informations. The need for informed consent. Obtaining informed consent ensures that narrators clearly understand the purpose of the research and voluntarily agree to participate, maintaining their control over how their stories are used. Then, addressing censorship and interpretations. Historians must carefully handle issues of censorship, self censorship, and interpretations to avoid misrepresentation or silencing participants' experiences. Then, towards inclusive and responsible history, by respecting the agency of participants and promoting collaborative approaches, oral history can be more inclusive, ethical, and responsible method of understanding and documenting the past. Thank you. Thank you very much.